Mic check. I'm not seeing anything. Mic check. Right. That's okay. I want you to use that one. Mic check.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here, not just for this event, but thank you for being here this morning, for being here on time. I appreciate that. I am excited about the things that we have planned for you today. Every event that is taking place today will be in this space, except for the number of receptions that we have, which will be, it will depend on your connection to Brite. And so check out the number of receptions that we have around 4:30, and then you can determine which one will be the best for you. Today, we will have the honor of a lecture by Dr. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda, and Dr. Bellinger will be telling you a little bit more about her. We will be having our lunch break around 11:30, and again, you will be on your own for lunch. Please try to be back here by about 1:30. We'll have a set of panelists from 1:30 to, it'll be about a little over an hour. And then at 3 o'clock, we will have our organ recital. So you'll want to make sure that you don't miss that either. And as I said, all the events except for the receptions will be taking place in this space. And so again, thank you. Welcome again to Ministry Week, Day 3. And now I will pass it on to Dr. Bellinger to introduce our lecturer for this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisette. I'm Dr. Charles Bellinger. I teach theology and ethics here. I'm honored to introduce our speaker, who comes to us from the Bay Area in California. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda has lectured many different continents: Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, Latin America, and of course North America, in many places. She focuses on climate justice, climate racism, moral agency, globalization, economic justice, public church, ecofeminist theology, and faith-based resistance to systemic oppression. She's the author or co-author of 7 volumes, including the award-winning Resisting Structural Evil, Love as Ecological Economic Vocation. Moe-Lobeda currently is creating a 7-volume series, Building a Moral Economy, Equitable, Ecological, and Democratic, Roadmaps for People of Courage, for which she will write the introductory volume. She serves as professor of theological and social ethics at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and the group of schools there in the Bay Area that's called the GTU. She is founding director of the PLTS Center for Climate Justice and Faith. She earned her doctoral degree from Union Theological Seminary. She loves hiking in the forests and mountains and spending time with family and friends. So her talk today is Building a Moral Economy, Healing from Empire. Please give her a warm welcome.
Good morning. I must say that I am so moved by the warmth and hospitality and generosity of Brite Divinity School. It has been a pleasure. Rowena Tart and Dr. Lisette Acosta have been marvelous. So thank you for this kind of beautiful reception that I've received. Your topic for this week, Empire, Ministry in an Age of Empire. You have taken on a matter of tremendous import. A ministry moment changed my life. Youth ministry. I was about 14, one of the youth at a regional gathering of Lutheran youth in the Pacific Northwest. And a film was shown. I think it was called Guess Who's Coming to Breakfast? And that film depicted the horrible suffering of people who worked on the fruit and sugar plantations in the Caribbean in order to produce our inexpensive breakfast products and to maximize profit for the companies. I was shocked. I was aghast that our food rendered such suffering for the people who were producing it. I had been formed by my church to believe that we're supposed to live in ways that love neighbor as self, not exploit neighbor. So I began to learn more, and I became all the more deeply troubled. Our food, farm workers being sprayed with toxic chemicals. Our clothing, sweatshop workers in Bangladesh forced to work in terribly dangerous conditions, sometimes deadly conditions. Our recreation, little kids in India sewing soccer balls in such conditions that they lost their sight by the age of 14. And all of this to maximize profit for some people and keep my consumer goods cheap. In the years since, people around the world and here in the US have taught me a lot more. I was commissioned by the church to serve as a missionary and health worker in Central America some years ago. And there the villagers and the campesinos with whom I worked would have their children hungry because the parents, though they worked hard all day long, didn't have un pedacito de tierra, a little piece of land, to grow corn and beans to feed their kids, because the land was owned by global companies from afar. I was in India. I had been called to India to work with seminaries on developing eco-justice curriculum in the seminaries. And there I met leaders of the church who talked with me about their work with villagers, tribal people who had been displaced from their lands after their people had worked them for centuries by bauxite mines that came in to mine the bauxite to produce our aluminum. So on and on and on. There were women in my church in Seattle, the shelter for homeless women, who worked full-time but didn't get paid enough to keep a shelter over their heads. So anyway, in my youth, as I began learning these things, I became an activist, and then I fell into a kind of despair, a kind of powerlessness. How could we do anything about the magnitude of these systemic issues? We can talk later, we'll see. We could talk about how the Spirit, the Holy Spirit working through people, helped to bring me out of that kind of despair and hopelessness that I had. But now, in retrospect, I realize I was confronted with a face of empire, economic empire, not created by people seeking to do wrong, but created by the systems that lock us all into them. And again, it became so clear to me that this wasn't necessarily the result of intentional wrong, but systemic implication that we're all involved in, that we don't know how to get out of. What I know now is that empire wants us to feel powerless. But God does not want God's people to feel or be powerless, and we are not. We are not powerless to reshape economic systems that lock us into exploiting neighbors whom we are called to love and exploiting and damaging Earth's life support systems. We are called and empowered by God to shape ways of living that serve our neighbors' well-being and our well-being and Earth's life support systems. This is integral to following Jesus in our time. And that calling, that dimension of ministry, is part of a love story that shakes the foundations of the world. You know that story well. Hear it again in 4 points. First, the beginning point is God's love. God, the creating, liberating, healing source, loves this world and each of us with a love that will not diminish, a love more powerful than any force in heaven or earth. And second, this God is at play in the world, breathing healing and life into the world. This Spirit is present within us and among us and beyond us. But that's not all. We human creatures, we are called to recognize this gracious love, to receive it, relish it, revel in it, and trust it. So let us pause for a moment. Pause just to let that promise flood over you, to fill every cell of your body. You are now, and in every moment of your entire life, beloved. Nothing you do or fail to do will ever change that. It is who you are. Thou art beloved. And now, the fourth chapter in the love story. After receiving and trusting God's love, we are then to embody it in the world by loving as God loves. We are beckoned to join with God's Spirit of justice-seeking, earth-honoring love in its steadfast commitment to gain fullness of life for all. This is our life's work, to receive and trust God's life-saving love and then live it into the world. This is not to win God's love, because that is a given. And as Martin Luther insists, I come from the Lutheran tradition, we never will love perfectly. We are, to the contrary, in his words, God's rusty tools. I love that image. Utterly fallible and finite in our capacity to enact justice-seeking love. What love is and requires in each time and place is the great moral question permeating Christian history. Martin Luther King said it well. I quote, "Our responsibility as Christians is to discover the meaning of this command and seek passionately to live it out in our daily lives." End quote. I love that, to discover the meaning of it in our time and place. What then does it mean for us? How do we carry out neighbor love in our time, in this age of economic empire? At the very least, it means reshaping economic life so that it supports life rather than exploiting and damaging life. The World Council of Churches and the Council for World Missions calls this building economies for life. So, how then do we build economies for life? The journey to economic lives that do not damage and destroy, but rather support life, can seem to wind through a vast, foggy mess. We may not know what steps to take or where the paths are. So, it seems to me that a framework can shed light through the fog. Today, this morning, we will consider a framework grounded in Christian ethics, my field of study. The framework has 3 building blocks. You can shift the slide. One is a shift in perspective to see economic life as a spiritual practice. Second is 3 terrains of change for healing economic life. And third is 10 fingers on the hands of healing economic life. So let's dig in. A shift in perspective to view economic life as a spiritual practice. The word economy, comes from the Greek oikonomos, which means the rules or guidelines, nomos, for how we are to organize and maintain the household of earth, the oikos. So we get rules or guidelines for maintaining the household. According to the biblical witness, God gave us two primary rules for ordering economic life. First, in Genesis 2:15, serve and preserve garden earth. And second, love your neighbor with a love that seeks justice, as we hear in Leviticus 18 and later repeated by Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. These two rules are to guide both our interpersonal lives and our lives as parts of social systems, like economies. That is a message of great worth. According to the biblical witness, economic life is not just about numbers and money. Economic life entails relationships that profoundly impact other people's lives. Those relationships are determined by economic systems, practices, policies, institutions. So I invite you to think about economies in this way. It acknowledges a crucial reality, a reality generally ignored. Our economic lives, that is, what we buy, consume, sell, throw away, invest, how we feed and shelter and transport our families, all this is in essence about relationships with people directly or indirectly impacted. Our daily economic life has tremendous impact on other people and on the earth. That impact may be damaging or life-giving. I noted some of my early encounters with the damaging impacts of our economic lives. For example, my buying tomatoes harvested by people in Florida forced to work in toxic conditions for far too little pay and no benefits puts me in a harmful relationship with those workers. But by asking my grocery store to purchase only tomatoes produced by workers who are protected by a fair food agreement, which gives them a penny more a pound and more humane working conditions, I then enter into a life-giving relationship with those workers. My relationship with them has changed. Just imagine the difference in their lives. Economic practices and policies and structures can determine whether people live or die, flourish or decline. They dictate who will have food and health care. Famines, for example, in recent centuries have resulted primarily from maldistribution of food and income, or from land being accumulated by large companies instead of being reserved for people who need it to grow food. Likewise, urban food deserts in the U.S. are created by economic decisions of governments and corporations. All who benefit from these decisions, investors, consumers, employers, and more, that is us, are in relationship with the people denied access to adequate food. God's love, according to the biblical witness, fiercely and tenderly seeks justice and well-being for the widow, the orphan, the outcast, the impoverished, and all on the margins of power and privilege. And it calls people, that is, us, to embody that love. Spiritual practices are what deepen our capacity to receive and trust God's justice-seeking, earth-treasuring love, and then live it into the world through our activities of daily life. Thus, we may see economic life as a spiritual practice, a way of either enacting a spirituality of neighbor love or betraying neighbor love. Building economic practices, policies, principles that serve the well-being, especially of marginalized people, and that serve and preserve God's good garden earth. These are at the heart of neighbor love. Therefore, 3 primary guidelines for economic life are this. They build equity rather than a gap between the rich and the poor. That is one guideline. A second guideline for economic life, or for economic policies and practices entailed in economic life. They enable Earth's life systems, water, soil, air, climate, to flourish. And third, they're based on shared and accountable power, not power concentrated in just a few hands. We know these guideposts as equitable, ecological, and democratic. This shift to see economic life as a spiritual practice, guided by these 3 guidelines, is the first building block in the framework we consider today. The framework that we see here, the first building block, a shift in perspective, seeing economic life as spiritual practice. Let's move to the second block in that framework. I call it 3 terrains. Building moral economies requires change in 3 terrains of our lives. They are our daily practices, our practices of everyday living. Secondly, the social structures of which we're a part. And third, our mindsets or worldviews. That includes theology. Change in one of those, daily practices, social structures, worldviews, opens doors for change in the others. Listen in on a fascinating argument that my students in an ethics class had about these terrains. They were doing a project for a class. It's called the Interrupting Injustice Project. One student said, "The most important thing is people's individual behaviors. Households just shifting to habits that are ecologically sane and don't exploit people. That is the key. You know, if everyone just bought mostly local food and shopped in worker-owned companies and rode the bus or bike instead of cars all the time, used less plastic, bought fair trade food, that would change our economy." End quote. No, another student argued. What individuals do in everyday practice is pretty insignificant. We need structural change, systems change, we need public policy change, legal mandates, large-scale corporate and institutional revamping. End quote. She was talking about the second terrain. Another student pushed further into that third terrain, saying, "Friends, we need whole new ways of thinking, a shift in our mindsets. We need a new story that revises the purpose of economic life away from maximizing profit and holds creation as sacred rather than just as commodities to buy and sell. Only then, by thinking differently, will we change our economic systems," she insisted. "Oh, and by the way," she said, "that changed thinking includes theology and liturgy." Well, as the term went on, it was a delight to help this class unearth the synergy between change in these 3 terrains: behaviors, lifestyles, and secondly, social systems, and third, mindset or worldview. I want to share with you a brief story from ministry. It illustrates the synergy between change in those 3 arenas. And it also illustrates a congregation's response to God's call to us to build economic life away from exploitative economies to economies that support life, and doing that as a face of neighbor love in our time. A student group in one of my classes was assigned to create a ministry project in their teaching parish. A teaching parish is where the students do practical work. You all know that. Practice being pastors before they finish school. They had to do a project that would help their congregation practice economic and ecological, practice economic justice as a part of their life of faith. And they were to involve the worship life of the congregation. So it was not just a project of like the social justice committee of the church. So they did an ingenious project. They grounded it first. This is a Lutheran context again that they were working out of. They grounded it in Martin Luther's understanding of the Eucharist, of Holy Communion. Do most of you come from denominations that practice the Eucharist? Yeah, okay. That's a good thing, otherwise this would mean nothing to you. So I'm so glad to hear that. They started with a confirmation class, the youth, and they explored Luther's understanding of the Eucharist. He teaches that where the Eucharist is properly practiced, it creates a community of people engaged in public life on behalf of the common good. The Eucharist creates this, especially the good of impoverished people. For Luther, that included specifically denouncing, theologically denouncing from the pulpit, exploitative economic practices that were emerging in his time. Luther writes this about the life-changing impact of the Eucharist. Mind you, when I started reading these dimensions of Luther, it blew my mind. I had never learned them as a child. His incredibly trenchant economic ethics grounded in his teachings about the Eucharist. He writes, "Thus, by means of this sacrament, all self-seeking love is rooted out and gives place to that which seeks the common good of all." End quote. He writes, "In times past, this sacrament was so properly used, and the people were taught to understand it so well, that they even gathered food and material goods in the church and then distributed those among people in need. This has all disappeared, and now there remain only the many who receive this sacrament without in the least understanding or practicing what it signifies. They do not help the poor, care for the sorrowing, suffer with the suffering." End quote. You see, he thought there was tremendous moral power in the Eucharist, and he was drawing on some of what we know about the early church and the practices of care for and feeding hungry people that came out of the Eucharist. Well, then these seminaries asked what it would mean to properly practice the Eucharist in ways that had that transformative impact, leading people to serve neighbors' well-being today in the midst of exploitative economic life. They decided that the confirmation class was to analyze the congregation's practice of the Eucharist. They were to trace any damage that was done to people or the earth by virtue of their communion practice. They traced the bread and the wine and the juice, the textiles on the altar, the cups and the plate, where the wheat and grapes were likely grown, how the workers were treated, how far it was shipped, because shipping things from thousands of miles emits tremendous greenhouse gases into the air. They traced all that stuff. They were appalled to find the damage that was done, the lives hurt, just in the production and transport of the things that were used in the Eucharist. The confirmands shared this with the adults in the congregation. Then, the seminarians asked the youth to propose a complete redesign of the Eucharist so that it damaged no one. That is, so that the Eucharist became an act of love for other people impacted rather than hurting them. And they convinced enough adults in the congregation that this was really important and that it related to loving or damaging neighbors. And therefore, it had to do with following Jesus and God's call to love neighbors. So they ended up changing the bread to locally produced bread by a cooperative that paid its workers right. They ended up using wine and juice that was produced in ways that were equitable and ecological. They didn't ship things in from many, many miles away. They didn't use any textiles on the altar and such that were made in sweatshop type conditions. What if they had had time to go even further? What if they had had time to go in further and point out that they needed to move beyond the practices of their congregation to really make a difference? Perhaps they could call upon their entire denomination, the whole Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, to examine its Eucharistic practices. Or they could tell the grocers in their area that they would continue to buy supplies from them only if they supplied the supply chains behind their products weren't exploitative. Or they could divest funds from companies that produce textiles by exploiting workers. There are all kinds of things they could do in terms of public witness if they had had a little more time. This led to change in the lifestyle of the congregation and change in systems, or a part of change in systems. But what about that third terrain, worldview, mindset? I believe that this ministry project also had impact on that terrain. For example, no longer could people in the congregation see their neighbors only as the people they encountered in daily life. No, their neighbors were people around the community and the world impacted by their daily practices, people who grew the fruit that went into the juice. People in Bangladesh and Haiti, ravaged by the fierce storms made so much worse by climate change that is caused in part by our greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted in voluminous quantities by our transport of goods so many distances. Also, no longer could the congregation's purchasing be governed by a mindset that we should just buy whatever is cheapest. Do you know that mindset? It's the one I have. Get the cheapest strawberries I can get. Well, now whenever, so it's a different mindset to say, if I have the economic means, then why don't I think about getting the products that are produced rightly? So I would argue that the congregation's worldview and mindset also was impacted by this project. We'll hold off and discuss more fully this third terrain of worldview change when we talk about 10 fingers on the hands of economic transformation. We'll call this finger changing the story, but let's hold off on that until the second part of the lecture. For now, my point is this: transformation of economic life, of our practices and structures and claims about the economy, entails change in 3 terrains of human existence: practices of individuals and households and churches, etc., social structures, and third, mindsets, worldviews, or guiding narratives. We have looked at 2 of those building blocks in the framework for building moral economies: as a way of loving neighbor as self. The shift to perceive economic life as a spiritual practice, and then the three terrains. Let's move now to introduce the final building block, and then we'll dig into it more after the coffee break. Let me check my minutes here. Okay, we're good. And I'll try to leave a little time for question and answers before the coffee break also. So this third bill, I think you can move the slide. This third building block is called 10 Fingers on the Hands of Healing Economic Life. So listen, folks, we accomplish amazing things with our hands. We create splendid music on a piano or a reed flute. How many of you touch an instrument with your fingers at some time in your life? Or we carve a piece of wood. We scribble a poem. We plant a seed. We change a diaper. We create a glorious meal. Each finger plays a slightly different role in the complex system that makes up a hand. One finger alone does not do much. Yet what magnificent creations they render when they dance in collaboration. This is the way with great movements to heal society of terrible wrongs. From abolishing chattel slavery to dismantling economic exploitation. Many different forms of action, different fingers on the hands of healing are needed. The beauty of this is that every person or group has a role to play. Different gifts chime in, from art and music to legal strategies, from financial acuity to public protest, from liturgy to listening, from legislative action to education and more. You may not be drawn to one form of action, but your gifts will fit with another. So here we'll sketch 10 fingers on the hands of healing our economic life. That is 10 different forms of action that, working together, will enable us to transform predatory forms of economic life into economies that serve life. They are, and you can see them here, build the new. These are code words. These are just title words. Build the new, live lightly, change the rules. So build the new, we'll talk about that. Change the rules, move the money, resist the wrong, build the bigger we, practice awe and gratitude, lament and holy anger. Listen and amplify. Change the story and drink the Spirit's courage. So I hope as we explore this array, this rich array, you will gain a clearer sense of what already is or what may become your ministry in the movement to build more compassionate and earth-honoring economies. Bear in mind that no one of these 10 forms of action is the main one, the best, the most important. Multiple forms of action are necessary, and they're interdependent, and they're inadequate apart from the other forms. I wanted to share with you a story that exemplifies that interdependence a little bit. And I recall well learning this very clearly, the interdependence of forms of action from a church in Washington, D.C., and a network of co-ops it had created along with economically marginalized people. This was Luther Place Memorial Church, the church in which I raised my kids, and then left and moved to Seattle, and my husband was a pastor there. And we left and moved to Seattle, and I ended up coming back to learn from some of the work that they were doing subsequently. They had recently, when I went to spend some days with them, they had recently won a huge victory. The church community was helping a group of low-income people to buy their apartment complex that was going to be sold out from under them in a gentrification process. In other words, prices were going up, the apartment building was going to be sold and made much more expensive, and they would have lost their homes. So they worked together and they created a new housing option. They bought, the low-income residents ended up buying the building and creating their own equity and homes. I call that a part of this finger that we call building the new. Some people are building the new as the way to achieve a more equitable economy. And think it's the only way. So that means building the new is building new forms of business, finance, energy, agriculture, housing that enable people that aren't exploitative and that enable people to afford them. So some people will say that's all we need to do to build a new economy, just build small-scale businesses and local and regional agriculture. This group, however, at the church taught me the importance of not only building the new, but depending upon other forms of action. They said that it would have been impossible to buy that building if 10 years earlier, other people in other church communities had not specifically passed a policy in the city that somehow gave the first right of purchase to the people that lived in the building. I don't know the specifics of the policy. What I know is that this effort to build the new depended upon 10 years ago, people doing the change the rules finger. Change the rules has to do with public policy. The point is simply this: deep economic change cannot be achieved by one form of action alone. All fingers on the hands of healing are needed. We're going to look more closely later this morning on 3 of those forms of action. We'll look at change the rules, change the story. Which 3 did I choose? Build the new, change the rules, and change the story. And then we'll glimpse the other 7, just enough so that you can imagine what they look like in practice. But before we do that, I thought it would be perhaps useful to stop for a moment and let me ask you to do one thing. 2 things. The first is take a moment to think about your own life and notice, what do you grieve or lament about in terms of the economy as we know it? What causes you to grieve? And then the second thing is, who do you know, it could be yourself, yourself or other, who has been damaged by economic life as we know it, by the economy as we know it now. Any thoughts, responses to those 2 questions? What you grieve or lament, or who may have been damaged? You, sir, in the back, who's nodding? Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yes. Yeah. Very real, very, very real. I resonate with what you just said because I was recently in Norway, and I learned from a Sami theologian. The Sami are the indigenous of the Arctic region. We used to call the Sami Laplanders, but the word now is Sami, and he said that the Norwegian government was putting windmills, which are a good thing, but putting them up on their reindeer herding lands. And it was destroying the reindeer herding lands with the windmills, and the people needed the reindeer herding for their economy and culture. So that's very real, the complexity and the ambiguity. And the framework for thinking about that is a term that is developed coming out of largely countries of the global south, what we used to call the developing world, called just transition. And it's a term that I think it's an incredible concept. It means not only transitioning to renewable energies like windmills, but doing it with a justice lens so that we look, how do we can't have what's called sacrifice zones. So those lands, those who need the livestock in those lands in West Texas or up in the Nordic region of the Arctic region of Norway, they can't be sacrificed. So the renewable energies need to be created in ways that don't, and we have the ingenuity and the creativity as human beings to do that. There's no doubt about it. We can send people, to the moon. We can create renewable energy that doesn't damage vulnerable people. We can do that, only though if we have that lens on it. So very, very real, yeah. And you can think about that in many dimensions of the transition to renewable energy. Yes.
the mountains of Jamaica where I lived, there were small farmers. And they used this additional income to strengthen their farms, to build, to add a room to their houses, and incrementally, over many years, build a house. So those are the two sides, exploitation, and they knew they were being exploited. But they were willing to be exploited because of the conditions in which they lived in the mountains of Jamaica. So another ambiguous situation, I think,
Yes.
I mentioned.
And there are so many ambiguities. So that the aim then would be to change the rules and move the money, which has to do with where we invest, divesting and investing, in ways that push companies not to do the exploitative practices, but to do equitable practices. We'll take one other hand that was right up here. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Women were excluded and slaves were excluded.
Yes. Very real. I am not holding up that as ideal. Mind you, I'm only pointing to that as an indicator of the wisdom of being involved in establishing the terms, the rules for our life together, which is public policy in part. Good. Very good. Yes, indeed, indeed. The threat to the emerging but imperfect forms of democracy in that time.
Okay, I think we should take a break. Take a break for 30 minutes, and then we'll continue this excellent discussion.
Okay, good. In fact, this is where I was planning to take a break.
Okay.
So that's just perfect.
Okay.
Enjoy your coffee break. That's
About 10:30, we'll regather.
okay, perfect. Oh, yeah.